The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. Part 1. Losses. Introduction. Neurology's favorite word is deficit, denoting an impairment or incapacity of neurological function. Loss of speech, loss of language, loss of memory, loss of vision, loss of dexterity, loss of identity, and myriad other lacks and losses of specific functions or faculties. For all of these dysfunctions, another favorite term, we have privative words for every sort. Aphonia, aphamia, aphasia, alexia, abrexia, agnosia, amnesia, ataxia. A word for every specific neural or mental function of which patients, through diseases or injury or failure to develop, may find themselves partly or wholly deprived. The scientific study of the relationship between brain and mind began in 1861, when Broca, in France, found that specific difficulties in the expressive use of speech, aphasia, consistently followed damage to a particular portion of the left hemisphere of the brain. This opened the way to a cerebral neurology, which made it possible over the decades to map the human brain, ascribing specific powers, linguistic, intellectual, perceptual, etc., to equally specific centers in the brain. Towards the end of the century, it became evident to more acute observers, above all to Freud, in his book Aphasia, that this sort of mapping was too simple, that all mental performances had an intricate internal structure and must have an equally complex physiological basis. Freud felt this, especially in regard to certain disorders of recognition and perception, for which he coined the term agnosia. All adequate understanding of aphasia or agnosia would, he believed, require a new, more sophisticated science. The new science of brain-mind which Freud investigated came into being in the Second World War, in Russia, at the joint creation of A.R. Luria and his father, R.A. Luria. Leontief, Anokhin, Bernstein, and others, and was called by them neuropsychology. The development of this immensely fruitful science was the life work of A.R. Luria, and considering its revolutionary importance, it was somewhat slow in reaching the West. It was set out systematically in a monumental book, Higher Cortical Functions in Man, 1966, and in a wholly different way in a biography or bastography, The Man with a Shattered World, 1972. Although these books were almost perfect in their way, there was a whole realm which Luria had not touched. Higher cortical functions in man treated only those functions which apparented to the left hemisphere of the brain. Similarly, Zastitsky, subject of The Man of the Shattered World, had a huge lesion in the left hemisphere. The right was intact. Indeed, the entire history of neurology and neuropsychology can be seen as a history of the investigation of the left hemisphere. One important reason for the neglect of the right, or minor hemisphere, as it has always been called, is that while it's easy to demonstrate the effects of variously located lesions on the left side, the corresponding syndromes on the right side are much less distinct. It was presumed, usually contemptuously, to be more primitive than the left, the latter being seen as the unique flower of human evolution. And in a sense, this is correct. The left hemisphere is more sophisticated and specialized, a very late outgrowth of the primate and especially the hominid brain. On the other hand, It's the right hemisphere which controls the crucial powers of recognizing reality, which every living creature must have in order to survive. The left hemisphere, like a computer tracked onto the basic creature brain, is designed for programs and schematics, and classical neurology was more concerned with schematics than the reality. So that when at last some of the right hemisphere syndromes emerged, they were considered bizarre. There had been attempts in the past, for example, by Anton in 1890s and Wurzel in 1928, to explore right hemisphere syndromes, but these attempts themselves had been bizarrely ignored. In The Working Brain, one of his last books, Leura devoted a short but tantalizing section to the right hemisphere syndromes, ending, "These still completely unstudied defects lead us to one of the most fundamental problems, to the role of the right hemisphere in direct consciousness. The study of this highly important field has been so far neglected. It will receive a detailed analysis in a special series of papers in preparation for publication." Leura did finally write some of these papers in the last months of his life, when mortally ill. He never saw their publication, nor were they published in Russia. He sent them to R. L. Gregory in England, and they will appear in Gregory's forthcoming Oxford Companion to the Mind. Inner difficulties and outer difficulties match each other here. It's not only difficult, it's impossible for patients with certain right hemisphere syndromes to know their own problems. A peculiar and specific anosognosia, as Babinski called it, and it's singularly difficult for even the most sensitive observer to picture the inner state, the situation, of such patients, for this is almost unimaginably remote from anything he himself has ever known. Left hemisphere syndromes, by contrast, are relatively easily imagined. Although right hemisphere syndromes are as common as left hemisphere syndromes, why should they not be? We will find 1,000 descriptions of left hemisphere syndromes in the neurological and neuropsychological literature for every description of the right hemisphere syndrome. It's as if such syndromes were somehow alien to the whole timber of neurology. And yet, as Leura says, they are of the most fundamental importance, so much so that they may demand a new sort of neurology, a personalistic, or as Leura liked to call it, a romantic science. For the physical foundation of the persona, the self, are here revealed for our study. Leura thought a science of this kind would be best introduced by story, a detailed case history of a man with a profound right hemisphere disturbance, a case history which would at once be the complement and opposite of the man with a shattered world. In one of his last letters to me he wrote, "Publish such histories. Even if they are just sketches, it's a realm of a great wonder." I must confess to being specially intrigued by these disorders, for they open realm, or promised realms, scarcely imagined before, pointing to an open and more spacious neurology and psychology, excitingly different from the rather rigid and mechanical neurology of the past. It's then less deficits in the traditional sense, which have engaged my interest than neurological disorders affecting the self. Such disorders may be of many kinds, and may arise from excesses no less than impairments of function, and it seems reasonable to consider these two categories separately, but it must be said from the outset that a disease is never a mere loss or excess, that there is always a reaction on the part of the affected organism or individual to restore, to replace, to compensate for, and to preserve its identity, however strange the means may be, and to study or influence these means. No less than the primary insult to the nervous brain is an essential part of our role as physicians. This was powerfully stated by Evie McKenzie. For what is it that constitutes a disease entity or a new disease? The physician is concerned, not like the naturalist, with a wide range of difficult organisms, theoretically adapted in an average way to an average environment, but with a single organism, the human subject, striving to preserve its identity in diverse circumstances. This dynamic, this striving to preserve identity, however strange the means or effects of such striving, was recognized in psychiatry long ago, and like so much else, especially associated with the work of Freud. Thus, the delusions of paranoia were seen by him not as primary, but as attempts, however misguided, at restitution, at reconstructing a world reduced by complete chaos. In precisely the same way, Evie McKenzie wrote, "The pathological physiology of the Parkinsonian syndrome is the study of an organized chaos, a chaos induced in the first instance by destruction of important integrations, and reorganized on an unstable basis in the process of rehabilitation. As awakenings was the study of an organized chaos produced by a single of multiform disease, so what now follows is a series of similar studies of the organized chaos produced by a great variety of diseases. In this first section, losses, the most important case to my mind is that of a special form of visual agnosia, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. I believe it to be of fundamental importance. Such cases constitute a radical change to one of the most entrenched axioms or assumptions of classical neurology in particular, the notion that brain damage, any brain damage, reduces or removes the abstract and categorical attitude, in Kurt Goldstein term, reducing the individual to the emotional and concrete. A very similar thesis was made by Hollings Jackson in 1860s. Here, in the case of Dr. B, we see the very opposite of this. A man who has, albeit only in the sphere of the visual, wholly lost the emotional, the concrete, the personal, the real, and been reduced, as it were, to the abstract and categorical, with consciousness, with consequences of a particularly preposterous kind. What would Hollings, Jackson, and Goldstein have said of this? I have often in imagination asked them to examine Dr. B and then said, "Gentlemen, what do you say now?" 1. The man who mistook his wife for a hat. Dr. B was a musician of distinction, well known for many years as a singer, and then at the local school of music as a teacher. It was here, in relation to his students, that certain strange problems was first observed. Sometimes a student would present himself, and Dr. B would not recognize him, or specifically, would not recognize his face. The moment the student spoke, he would be recognized by his voice. Such instances multiplied, causing embarrassment, perplexity, fear, and sometimes comedy, for not only did Mr. B increasingly fail to see faces, but he saw faces when there were no faces to see. Generally mago-like when in the street he might bat the heads of water hydrants and barking meters, taking these to be the heads of children. He would amiably address carved knobs on the furniture and be astonished when they didn't reply. At first these odd mistakes were laughed off as jokes, not least by Dr. B himself. Had he not always had a quirky sense of humor and been given to Zen-like paradoxes and gestes? His musical powers were as dazzling as ever. He didn't feel ill. He had never felt better. And the mistakes were so ludicrous and so ingenious that they could hardly be serious or betook on anything serious. The notion of there being something the matter didn't merge until some 3 years later, when diabetes developed. Well aware that diabetes could affect his eyes, Dr. B consulted an ophthalmologist, who took a careful history and examined his eye closely. "There is nothing the matter with your eyes," the doctor concluded, "but there is trouble with the visual parts of your brain. You don't need my help, you must see a neurologist." And so, as a result of this referral, Dr. B came to me. It was obvious within a few seconds of meeting him that there was no trace of dementia in the ordinary sense. He was a man of great cultivation and charm, who talked well and fluently, with imagination and humor. I couldn't think why he had been referred to our clinic, and yet there was something a bit odd. He faced me as he spoke, was oriented towards me, and yet there was something the matter. It was difficult to formulate. He faced me with his ears, I came to think, but not with his eyes. These, instead of gazing at me, taking me in the normal way, made sudden strange fixation on my nose, on my right ear, down to my chin, up to my right eye, as if nothing, even studying these individual features, but not seeing my whole face, its changing expression, me as a whole. I'm not sure that I fully realized this at the time. There was just a distinct strangeness, some failure in the normal interplay of gaze and expression. He saw me, he scanned me, and yet... "What seems to be the matter?" I asked him at length. "Nothing that I know of," he replied with a smile, "but people seem to think there is something wrong with my eyes." "But you don't recognize any visual problems?" No, not directly, but I occasionally make mistakes." I left the room briefly to talk to his wife. When I came back, Dr. B was sitting placidly by the window, attentive, listening rather than looking out. "Traffic," he said. "Street sound, distant trains, they make a sort of symphony, don't they? You know, Hunger, Pacific 234. What a lovely man, I thought to myself. How can there be anything seriously the matter? Would he permit me to examine him? Yes, of course, Dr. Sax. I still denied disquiet, his perhaps too, in the soothing routine of neurological exam. Muscle strength, coordination, reflexes, tone. It was while examining his reflexes, a trifle abnormal on the left side, that the first bizarre experience occurred. I had taken off his left shoe and scratched the sole of the foot with a key, a frivolous seeming but essential test of a reflex, and then excusing myself to screw my ophthalmoscope together, left him to put the shoe himself. To my surprise, a minute later, he hadn't done this. "Can I help?" I asked. "Help what?" "Help whom?" "Help you put on your shoes." "Eck," he said, "I have forgotten the shoe," adding, "Sod was, the shoe." He seemed baffled. "Your shoe," I repeated. "Perhaps you put it on." He continued to look downwards, though not at the shoe, with an intense but misplaced concentration. Finally his gaze settled on his foot. "That is my shoe, yes?" Or did I mishear? Did I mishear what he said? My eyes, he explained, and put a hand to his foot. This is my shoe. No? No, this is not. That is your foot. There is your shoes. Oh, I thought that was my foot. Was he joking? Was he mad? Was he blind? If this was one of these, his strange mistakes, it was the strangest mistake I had ever come across. I helped him on with his foot, to avoid further complication. Dr. B himself seemed untroubled, indifferent, maybe amused. I resumed my examination. His visual acuity was good. He had no difficulty seeing a bin on the floor, though sometimes he missed it if it was placed to his left. He saw right, but what did he see? I opened out a copy of National Geographic magazine and asked him to describe some pictures in it. His response here was very curious. His eyes would dart from one thing to another, picking up tiny features, individual features, as they had done with my face. A striking brightness, a color, a shape would arrest his attention and elicit comment. But in no case did he get the scene as a whole. He failed to see the whole, seeing only details, which he spotted like blips on a radar screen. He never entered into relation with the picture as a whole, never faced, so to speak, its physiognomy. He had no sense whatever of a landscape or scene. I showed him the cover, an unbroken expanse of Sahara dunes. What do you see here? I asked. I see a river, he said, and a little guest house with its terrace on the water. Perhaps our people are dining out on the terrace. I see colored parasols here and there. He was looking, if it was looking, right off the cover into mid-air, and confabulating non-existing features, as if the absence of features in the actual picture had driven him to imagine the river and the terrace and the colored parasols. I must have looked aghast. But he seemed to think he had done rather well. There was a hint of a smile on his face. He also appeared to have decided that the examination was over and started to look around for his hat. He reached out his hat and took hold of his wife's hat, tried to lift it off, to put it on. He had apparently mistaken his wife for a hat. His wife looked as if she was used to such things. I could make no sense of what had occurred in terms of conventional neurology or neuropsychology. In some ways he seemed perfectly preserved, and in others absolutely incomprehensibly devastated. How could he on the one hand mistake his wife for a hat, and on the other function, as apparently he still did, as a teacher at the music school? I had to think, to see him again, and to see him in his own familiar habitat, at home. A few days later I called on Dr. B and his wife at home, with a score of Ditrolib in my briefcase. I know he liked Schumann, and a variety of odd objects for the testing of perception. Mr. B showed me into a lofty apartment, which recalled fin de siècle Berlin. A magnificent old Bosendorfer stood in state in the center of the roof, and all around it were music stands, instruments, scores. There were books, there were paintings, but the music was central. Dr. B came in, a little bowed and distracted, advanced with his outstretched hand to the grandfather clock, but hearing my voice corrected himself and shook hands with me. We exchanged greetings and chatted a little of current concerts and performance. Diffidently, I asked him if he would sing. "The Ditrolib," he exclaimed, "but I can no longer read music." "You will play them, yes?" I said I would try. On that wonderful old piano, even my playing sounded right. And Dr. B was an aged but infinitely mellow-featured disco, combining a perfect ear and voice with the most incisive musical intelligence. It was clear that the music school was not keeping him on out of charity. Dr. B's temporal lobe were obviously intact. He had a wonderful musical cortex. What I wondered was going on in his parietal and occipital lobes, especially on those areas where visual processing occurred. I carried the platonic solids in my neurological kit and decided to start with these. "What is this?" I asked, drawing out the first one. "A cube, of course." "Now this?" I asked, brandishing another. He asked if he might examine it, which he did swiftly and systematically. "A dodecahedron, of course. And don't bother with the others. I will get the icosahedron too." Abstract shapes clearly presented no problems. "What about faces?" I took out a pack of cards. All of these he identified instantly, including the jacks, queens, kings, and jokers. But these, after all, are stylized designs, and it was impossible to tell whether he saw faces or merely patterns. I decided I would show him a volume of cartoons which I had in my briefcase. Here again, for the most part, he did well. Churchill's cigar, Chaucer's nose. As soon as he had picked out a key feature, he could identify the face. But cartoons, again, are formal and schematic. It remained to be seen how he would do with real faces, realistically represented. He had difficulty even recognizing himself in a mirror, as Macri and Trolley described in detail. The early convalescent face he frequently, especially when shaving, questioned whether the face gazing at him was really his own. And even though he knew it could physically be none other, on several occasions grimaced or stuck out his tongue just to make sure. By carefully studying his face in the mirror, he slowly began to recognize it, but not in a flash, as in the past. He relied on the hair, facial outline, and on two small moles on his left cheek. In general, he couldn't recognize objects at a glance, but would have to seek out and guess from one or two features. Occasionally, his guesses were absurdly wrong. In particular, the authors note, there was difficulty with animate. On the other hand, simple schematic objects, scissors, watch, key, presented no difficulties. Macri and Trolley also note that his topographical memory was strange. The seeming paradox existed that he could find his way from home to hospital and around the hospital, but yet could not name streets en route. Unlike Dr. B, he also had some aphasia, or appeared to visualize the topography. It was also evident that visual memories of people, even from long before the accident, were severely impaired. There was memory of conduct, or perhaps a mannerism, but not of visual appearance of face. Similarly, it appeared when he was questioned closely that he had no longer had visual images in his dreams. Thus, as with Dr. B, it wasn't visual perception, but visual imagination and memory. The fundamental powers of visual representation, which were essentially damaged in this patient, at least those powers, insofar as they pertained to the personal, the familiar, the concrete. A final humorous point, where Dr. B might mistake his wife for a hat, McRae's patients, also unable to recognize his wife, needed her to identify herself by a visual marker, by a conspicuous article of clothing such as a large hat.